All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in this morning for today's program. I want to thank you for joining us. My name is Pat Kane, Public Programs and Visitor Services Coordinator at the Museum of the Grand Prairie, part of the Champaign County Forest Preserve District, located in the heart of the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area. And I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning for a special program with a special guest. In just a few moments, we will be joined by the First Lady herself, Mary Lincoln, right here on Abraham Lincoln's 212th birthday today, February 12th. Abe Lincoln is 212 years old. So I want to especially thank Mary Lincoln for taking the time out of her day to join us this morning. And most importantly, thank all of you for joining us this morning. Before we get into today's program, I did want to go over a few housekeeping items, a couple upcoming events, some thank yous to some folks, and let you know what else is coming up at the Museum of the Grand Prairie in the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. First and foremost, if you haven't done so already, let us know where you're watching from by writing in the comment section down below the location where you're watching from this morning. I want to thank everybody who has already done that. Thanks to Ramona, a big fan of us. See you all the time tuning in, Ramona. Really appreciate you tuning in again from Rockford. Mike from Centralia, Illinois. Judith watching from Michigan. Sonia tuning in from Arizona, Tucson, Arizona. Thanks for tuning in. A little earlier than us in the Central Time Zone here in Illinois. Appreciate that, Sonia. Joyce from Mokina. Ginny from Lincolnshire, Illinois. Bonnie from Coal Valley. We got folks tuning in from Decatur, Mainville, Ohio. Kathleen from Canton. Kimberly from Elk Ridge, Maryland. Jan Harris watching from Selins Grove, Pennsylvania, wishing Mr. Lincoln a happy birthday. And she is really looking forward to seeing and hearing Mary. So am I. Jan, thanks for tuning in. Lauren from Springfield, Abe's hometown. Lorraine from Pekin. Martha from Albion, Illinois. Becky from St. Charles. Folks from Missouri, Wisconsin, and all over New Jersey. Again, Little Rock, Arkansas. Thank you so much for tuning in this morning. Wherever you are, whether you're located right here in Central Illinois or around the country, around the world. And also one other thing, should you have any questions throughout the course of the program, questions for Mary Lincoln, questions for me, feel free to write those down in the comment section below, and we'll answer those questions towards the end of this morning's program. Some things coming up and also some thank yous. So if you don't know anything about the Museum of the Grand Prairie, Champaign County Forest Preserve District, the Museum of the Grand Prairie opened originally as the Early American Museum in 1968, and our current mission is to collect, preserve, and interpret the cultural and natural history of Champaign County and East Central Illinois. We're also an accredited institution with the American Alliance of Museums and a site in the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area here in Illinois. Champaign County Forest Preserve District, we are a facility of, which is a collection of 7 forest preserves here in Champaign County. Some educational facilities, including our own and the Homer Lake Interpretive Center, golf course, Kickapoo Rail Trail, and so much more. Upcoming programs happening at the Museum of the Grand Prairie and the Forest Preserve District already happening. If you're local, I encourage you to get out safely in the wintertime if you're looking for an excuse to get outside. Participate in the Champaign County Forest Preserve District Snowflake Search. We've hidden 30 creatively painted and beautiful snowflake tree cookies throughout the forest preserves and would love for you to go out there and try and find them. There's also some fun facts next to each one of those snowflakes talking about natural history and cultural history. And we encourage you that if you find a snowflake, snap a picture and post it to social media using the hashtag CCFPD Snowflake Search. 1 week from yesterday, we will have another program in our Garden of Speaker series on Thursday, February 18th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. Again, here on our Facebook and YouTube pages. With a large amount of time everyone is spending at home these days, the theme for this year's Garden Speaker series is How To at Home, with programs focusing on how you can garden in various ways within your own home or on your own property. Ken Robertson of the Illinois Natural History Survey and Jack Zinnin of the U of I Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences will present an engaging virtual program titled How to Use the Diversity of Native Plants in Your Garden. So check out that program again, live on our Facebook page, Thursday, February 18th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. I also want to give a huge thank you to Looking for Lincoln for supporting this program today through their Bring a Lincoln grant program. I want to encourage you to check out our social media pages at the Museum of the Grand Prairie, where throughout the month of February, in honor of Abe Lincoln's birthday month, we'll be posting awesome information about Abraham Lincoln, as well as where you can find these really great Looking for Lincoln signs all throughout Champaign County that discuss Abraham Lincoln's interactions with local community members while he was practicing law on the 8th Judicial Circuit, and some really great stories involving our friend Abe Lincoln and Champaign County community members from the past. So check those out on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. Again, I want to thank Looking for Lincoln for supporting today's program. Also, this program is part of our special speaker series we've been doing for the past year plus, and it's been made possible with support from the following women-owned and/or women-led businesses and organizations. They include Campfire Concepts, ShannonBannonMoms.com, 5 Foot Productions, Guth and Associates LLC, Jessie Marie Studio LLC, the McGuire Home Collection, Organizing CU, Page Roasting Company, Simply Anchored Boutique, and the Right Start Preschool. So I want to thank those supporters again for supporting this series. And if you can, get out and support these businesses or visit their websites to learn how you can patronize these businesses who are supporting programs at the Museum of the Grand Prairie and Champaign County Forest Preserve District. Okay, again, let us know where you're watching from today. If you haven't done so already, writing that down in the comment section below. Aaron is watching from Parkville, Missouri. Christine watching near Pittsburgh. Aaron asked, how far are you from Springfield, Illinois? We are about an hour away on Interstate 72, located here in Champaign County, only about an hour's drive from Springfield, Illinois. Karen tuning in from Bloomington. Linda tuning in from Tissaquah. My apologies on the spelling there. I have to look into how to say that correctly. Thanks for tuning in, though, Linda. David from Carpentersville, Illinois. Sarah from Carmel, Indiana. Megan from Pawnee, Illinois. Suzanne all the way from Florida. Trisha from Chicago. Lori tuning in from Columbus, Ohio. And Nancy from Colorado. And Sonia is really looking forward, or she really enjoyed Mary sharing her famous cake recipe a few months ago. I love cake. So we'll see if she talks about cake today. Okay, so enough of me talking. Let's bring on the star of the show today, and I want to thank her so much for joining us. Let's give a warm virtual welcome to the First Lady of the 16th President of the United States, Mary Lincoln herself. Mary, how you doing?
I am doing wonderful. Thank you for having me today. I so appreciate it.
Yeah. Really looking forward to your presentation today. Really looking forward to hearing your stories. Also, one thing, if you wouldn't mind, real quick, it is your husband's 212th birthday.
It is.
So I thought maybe we could send him some happy birthday wishes, and those at home could help us. Mary, would you mind singing happy birthday to Abe Lincoln with me here at the start of the program?
Now, you know perfectly well I'm not a singer, but I'll give it my best try.
Okay. All right. Let's give it a shot. And those, I'm sorry, Mrs. Lincoln.
I'm just saying already, or whenever you're ready.
Okay. Those of you at home, sing along with us. And a 1, a 2, a 3.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday, dear Abraham Lincoln.
Happy birthday to you.
All right. Those of you out there got to hear my wonderful singing voice. That is not going to make me any money. But thanks for doing that, Mrs. Lincoln. Really looking forward to you sharing some stories. So without further ado, I'm going to go backstage and let you take away the show here. Thank you again so much for tuning in. Folks, if you have any questions for Mary Lincoln, again, write those in the comment section down below, and we'll address those questions at the end of the program.
Oh, well, thank you again for having me with you today. I'm always pleased to greet people that love Mr. Lincoln, and hopefully myself. And yes, today is his birthday, and I'm so sorry he cannot be with us today, but he is busy running a country right now and this little thing called a civil war. But I do remember one time on Mr. Lincoln's birthday when I told him how grateful I was to his mother, and I still am. But I can't tell many stories until I at least tell you how we got together and created a family. Now, in 1837, I accompanied my sister Frances to Springfield, Illinois, because our sister Elizabeth, who had married a man by the name of Ninian Edwards, had moved to Springfield. They built this grand house, and she had one reserved bedroom for each of her sisters to come to Springfield and hopefully find a husband. So I accompanied Frances. She was the first because she's a little older than I am. So she got to have the first attempt at finding a husband. In 1837, Springfield was a very small town. I was very shocked at how much smaller it was than Lexington. But nonetheless, I was enthralled with the fact that we had so many legislators walking the street, young, eligible legislators. You see, the state capital had just been moved to Springfield in that year, so it was quite active. But I did see this one tall, lanky gentleman at an affair where he spoke, and then when it was over, I overheard him speaking to several people. One of them happened to be his barber, and the other one a banker. And I was moved to the fact that how well he treated each one of those with the same respect. I had my eye on him, but I had to go back to Lexington, finish my education. And in 1839, my sister Frances was getting married. So I made my trek to Springfield to make my stay. We attended her wedding and I moved into my bedroom, and it was at a cotillion when that same tall, lanky gentleman approached me ever so gallantly. And he extended his long arm and he said, "Miss Todd, I want to dance with you in the worst way." Later that evening, I told my cousin Elizabeth Grimsley he did dance with me in the worst way. Now that became our joke for the rest of our lives. But I will say he was a good student and he is no longer stepping on my toes. Well, after a 2-year courtship with breakups and all sorts of things that happened in between, in November the 3rd, 1842, we decided we were going to get married at Reverend Dresser's house in his parlor. Well, Mr. Lincoln, he's known sometimes to talk way too much. And he mentioned to Ninian that we were going to be wed that evening. Well, Ninian then informed Elizabeth, who put her foot down and said, "I will not be married in that parlor. I will be married in her parlor in her home." But I refused to wait more than one day. We had already waited 2 years, and I wasn't going to wait another moment. So on November the 4th of 1842, Mr. Lincoln and I wed. We moved into our first home, the Globe Tavern, which is the same room that my sister Frances and her husband had stayed in until they finished building their house. So we moved into this little adobe, this one room, 14 by 10 room, and we, 9 months later, brought a child to live with us in the Globe Tavern. Now, mind you, that Globe Tavern was a very noisy place. We had legislators and lobbyists that would argue back and forth day and night. But when Robert came into the world, sadly, he made too much noise for them. So we quickly exited the Globe, found a little cottage on 4th Street to move into, until we could finally afford our house at the corner of 8th Street in Jackson, there in Springfield. It was a wonderful thing for us to purchase. It was small then, and it did undertake 2 makeovers in between the house it was to the house you might see today. Now, Robert, was a very sweet little boy, but as he grew older, we found ourselves going to have another baby, Eddie. Now, you see this? I don't know if you can see it from the camera, but this is one of Robert's toy soldiers that he used to play with. He always wanted to be a soldier, but after Eddie came along, he actually became a deserter. I think he missed being the only child, and he was a little jealous that Eddie was getting a little bit of his attention. So he would run away on many occasions, which would make me hysterical, running the streets, yelling, I've lost my son, he's run away. But in that moment, he had my undying attention. So that was his way of getting some of that attention back from his mother. Eddie was named after Mr. Lincoln's good friend, Edward Baker. And sadly, we only got to have our little Eddie for a little under 4 years. When he was a baby, well, going on 2, was when Mr. Lincoln won his nomination to the Congress. Excuse me. And we decided that we were going to move the whole family to Washington City because I thought we needed to introduce the city to the Lincolns. I was pushing Mr. Lincoln's political career very hard at that moment. But after a couple of months living yet again in a boarding house, this time with 2 children, a 2-year-old and almost a 5-year-old, so it was quite a tight fit. But I spent morning, noon, and night with them. I had no help. I was basically not in a very good place. So it was decided between the 2 of us, and because Mr. Lincoln felt we were a distraction to him while he was trying to work, that we would move to Lexington. Because we had already rented our house, we could not just return to Springfield. So we moved to Lexington for about 1.5 years of Mr. Lincoln's term. And it was wonderful because Robert was almost the same age as some of my younger siblings. So he had a lot of playmates. And he loved being in a house with servants that if you wanted a bowl of ice cream, all you had to do was say, I want a bowl of ice cream, and it magically appeared on the table for you to eat. But while we were there, our little Eddie, now he had a huge heart for such a little boy. He loved cats. I do believe he inherited that gene from his father. Mr. Lincoln loved cats as well. Well, one day Robert had been out playing with some of his aunts and uncles, which I find that very interesting that my siblings were almost the same age as my son. But they were outside playing, and Robert came across this little kitten, and he asked the man whose house they were playing in if he could have the cat. And the man said, take it. So Robert did. And when he walked in the house with that kitten, and Eddie saw that kitten, his heart just exploded with love. He would spend every waking minute with that little kitten, dipping broken pieces of bread into milk and feeding it and petting it and just giving it all the attention. But the secret was we had to keep that kitten under wraps. My stepmother did not like any of the cat family. But sadly, within a few days, she caught wind that this kitten was in our house, and she asked the servant to please throw it out, which was done. Eddie became uncontrollably screaming, carrying on. But after a couple of hours of listening to it, I guess she could take it no longer. But she sent 3 bowls of ice cream up to our room for me, Robert, and little Eddie. And after that, all was right with the world. Well, we got back to Springfield, and as I said, we only had our Eddie for a very short time. Within a few days, and I would say about 1.5 months of days, is when we lost our little Eddie. Robert was very confused. He had no idea how to accept this loss in his life. As much as he was jealous of him, he still loved his little brother. But by the end of that year of 1850, our next son was born, William Wallace Lincoln, December 1850, just 10 months after we lost our Eddie. Some people have always referred to him as our replacement child, and to some degree, that's probably very true. But William was named after the doctor, William Wallace, who took care of our little Eddie when he was so sick. He was also my sister Frances's husband. So the name was very easy. William, he was a delightful child, and he is probably the child that is most like me and Mr. Lincoln. He loves literature, he loves to write, he's just grown into be such a good child, a wonderful child. But by his 2nd birthday, we found out we were going to be having yet another child. Oh, Mr. Lincoln and I, we had our prayers that it was going to be a little girl. You see, there was a little girl that used to live down the street from us in Springfield, and she would come over on many occasions. And Mr. Lincoln loved to sit her on his lap in the backyard, and they would talk about the things he was growing or the birds or whatnot. He just found her attention to him so pleasing. But God had other plans. He graced us with yet another boy, Thomas Lincoln. When he was born, Mr. Lincoln stood up and said, "My goodness, Mother, he looks like a tadpole. His head is so large and his body is so small." I guess he didn't remember the other three boys. They tend to all look a little bit of alike. But that's the nickname that we ended up calling our Tad, was Tad. And he was a dreamboat of a child. Now, he had a bit of a speech impediment, but personally, I think that just added a lot to his personality. When he was about, 6 months old, I think, there was one day when I was preparing the bath for Willie and for Tad. Robert was out playing, I'm sure, but I was going to give them their bath. And I had taken all of Willie's clothes off, completely naked, standing there in our kitchen. And then I was turned my back, and I promise you, not more than a minute did I turn my back to take Tad's clothes off so I could prepare him for his side of the bath, when Willie decided he had had enough and he wanted to escape. And he tore out the back door of our house, off the porch, across the street, and on to a nice little empty lot full of grass. So I go grabbing Tad. I run towards the door. I'm yelling at Willie to come back here, come back here. And I look to my right. And who do I see but Mr. Lincoln? He was standing there, bent over, hard, laughing like I've never seen him laugh before. And I just gave him one of those looks. And I said, "Mr. Lincoln, would you mind please fetching your son before we are the talk of the town?" Reluctantly, Mr. Lincoln did do as I asked. But I had to giggle and I had to laugh myself, because here is Mr. Lincoln scooping up this little boy, naked as a baby jaybird, and swinging around in the sky, laughing, both of them. And it was just a delight. But that's the way Mr. Lincoln is with his children. There's nothing more important to him than being with his children, reading to his children, just having a good time with his children. In fact, I think it's his childish behavior when he's playing with them that I hope he never outgrows. Now, when Tad gets a little bit older, this is one of my favorite stories about Tad and his older brother, Robert. One day, Mr. Lincoln had gone into town and he asked Tad if he wanted to accompany him. And of course, Tad always wants to be with his father. But Tad is so short, he never holds his hand. He always holds onto Mr. Lincoln's coattails. Well, by the time they got into town, Mr. Lincoln ran into a friend, Mr. Davis, and they began talking. And about that time, Robert showed up, and he and Tad were whispering about something. And now I only know about this story because Mr. Lincoln came home and told me about it and was so animated, it became one of my favorite stories. So Mr. Lincoln was standing there talking to Mr. Davis, and he would listen with the other ear as he was hearing the two boys talking back and forth. And then suddenly he stopped, and he looked at Tad, and he said, "Tad, oh, here it is. Tad, show Mr. Davis that new pocket knife I got for you." And Tad looked at him like he had been shot out of a cannon. He just stood there and stared at him. And he said, "Well, what's the matter now? You ain't gone and lost it now, have you?" And Taddy said, "No." And then he stuttered around a few seconds more. And then he said, "But I ain't got it." And he says, well, where is it?" And he said, "Well, Bobby told me that if I were him, I would trade my pocket knife for his candy. So I did." And Mr. Lincoln said, "Oh, Bobby, now tell me, how much did you pay for that candy?" And Bobby stood there and he said, "Well, 1 bit." And he said, "Well, I paid 3 bits for that pocket knife." Do you think that was a fair trade? This is when the attorney comes out and Mr. Lincoln. And Bobby just stood there and said, "No, He's always been a very honest young man. And he dug into his pocket and he pulled out the pocket knife and he handed it back to Tad. Then Mr. Lincoln looks at Taddy and he says, "Okay, Tad, Robert gave you back his knife. Now you need to give him back his candy." We all know how that was going to end. And he just stood there and stared and says, "Well, I can't. I already ate it all up. And I don't have any money to buy any more." And Mr. Lincoln looked at him and says, "Well, I do believe this is going to be a dilemma. How do you think we should solve this? Is there any suggestions on how we can make this better?" And the two of them just kind of looked at each other, and then they looked at their father, and the father looked at them, and this went on for a good minute or so, I'm sure. And then finally he smiled, dug into his pocket, and pulled out one bit, handed it to Tad. He said, "Here, now you go buy some candy for Bobby, but never make a foolish deal ever again." Mr. Lincoln liked to teach his morals by using the slaughter as a threat. He was leading them down the road and they knew it, but that's how he was with his children. Now, as Mr. Lincoln and I were moving along in our political world, it came to the time when Robert decided he had had enough of education in Springfield, Illinois, and he wanted to try his hand at getting into Harvard. Now, he was going on about 17 years old when he made this decision. He told his father that this was his desire, and Mr. Lincoln wasn't going to debate the issue with him and tell him, "I don't think you're ready." He thought he needed to learn that on his own. So, put him on the train, sent him up to Harvard. He went in, took the exams, and he failed 15 of those 16 tests. But the president of Harvard saw in Robert his determination to attend Harvard. It's always been my favorite school. Wish I could have attended it. But he saw a genuineness in our son, and I'm pleased that he did. So he suggested to Robert that he go across to Exeter Academy. And if he goes to Exeter, which was just across the way, then he could get his grades. And once he got his grades, it was an automatic entrance into Harvard University. So he made the decision he would do that. So when Mr. Lincoln was asked to run as the Republican presidential nominee for in 1860, then about that time is when Robert told us that he had made his grades indeed, and he was going to be attending Harvard come the fall. So it was a wonderful moment for me, for Mr. Lincoln, and especially for our son, Robert. When he was a younger, before he decided to make this big change, another story just popped into my head. He was a member of the Springfield Cadets. And I think that's where he got his love even more, where it showed that he wanted to be a soldier. The Springfield Cadets, they had uniforms that were made much like the Union soldiers were designed. And in fact, we took the train, the cadets and me and a couple of other mothers, we took the train down to Alton, and I got to watch one of Mr. Lincoln's last political debates before the election, for his Senate election, which he lost to Stephen Douglas, but that's another story. But he lost it to Stephen Douglas, but I did get to hear him make a speech, and that was something I hadn't been able to really see since he made the House Divided speech in Springfield, and so it was interesting to go. But the boys, they had a grand time going down to Alton, Illinois, to see that debate. Now, once Mr. Lincoln, of course, wins his election, we make this long journey, to Washington City. Mr. Lincoln left on February the 11th, and me and the boys, the two younger boys, Willie and Tad, we left the next day on February the 12th, Lincoln's birthday. Robert actually came back from Harvard to accompany his father to Washington City. We rode the train all the way, and then we would meet up, and then for 10 days we were together, and then the threats on Mr. Lincoln's life got much more intense, so they separated us one more time. And Mr. Lincoln was snuck into Washington City via a carriage. But it was an interesting time. It was a scary time for Mr. Lincoln, especially me. I just couldn't imagine that anybody would not welcome any president, no matter who or what party they belonged to. But It was a big issue then because of Mr. Lincoln's stand on slavery. Well, when we get to Washington, Mr. Lincoln takes the oath, and we finally get to go into the White House and take a look around. And Mr. Lincoln and I, we took a turn to the right, and we went into the East Room, where there were some soldiers camped there to protect the White House, because the Confederate soldiers were right across the Potomac River from the capital city, and they wanted to protect the home. So they were camped in there, so when we got there, it would be a safe place to walk into. But when we walked in, the two boys, Willie and Ted, they took straight up the grand staircase. And for about 30, 40 minutes, we saw hide nor hair of those boys. And suddenly we're talking to these soldiers, and we hear this whooping and hollering, and they're coming down the stairs, and they had told us they'd been up in this area and that area, and they found a way to get up on the roof of the White House, and they could see the enemy clear across the Potomac River. They could see them over there. So they wanted to build a fort on top of the White House. With the help of Tom Pendle, he was able to do that. They had a cannon that was actually contrived out of a log that they had painted black, and then they had military uniforms that Mr. Lincoln provided for them, as well as some other children. And so they had a place to stay when they were watching for those enemies. But when we did all these things in the White House, I had met a woman. Her husband was Horatio Taft, and she told me that she had 2 boys and a girl. And I said, well, would they love to come and be at the White House and play with my children? Because they don't have any friends, and they're going to need something to do to keep them active. And she was more than willing to allow her children to come over to the White House. Bud and Holly and Julia. Bud was about the same age as Willie, and Holly was about the same age as Tad. Julia was a few years older. She was almost 16. So I utilized her age as a babysitter, which gave me a little bit more freedom. And I probably, if I think about it, I probably abused her a little bit by using her way more than she probably wanted to be used. But she was a godsend to me in helping me with those children. When they first came into the White House, the boys, of course, immediately took them up onto the roof to show them their fort, which they spent a lot of time there, pretending. Mr. Lincoln also had some uniforms provided for Bud and Holly, so they would have those to play Army in. But there was also this doll that Mr. Lincoln had purchased for Tad when we first were going to Washington. And they named this doll Jack. He's a Zouave. He's a Zouave uniform of the military, and the 4 boys, along with Julia, not Julia as much as the 4 boys, but every day, at least once, they would put Jack on trial for some military crime or another, and then they would find him guilty, and then they would sentence him to die, either by hanging or by firing squad. And this would go on every day, and they would take the doll and they would play a death dirge on their makeshift instruments, and then they would walk ever so solemnly out to the White House Rose Garden, and they would bury him. And every night, Mr. Lincoln would have to go out to the Rose Garden and unbury dear Jack, so we could repeat this every single day. Poor Jack really got a beating. I've cleaned him up a little bit, but there's still mud and things on his clothes. But they loved doing this with this doll. Well, one day, when they were doing one of the burials, preparing to bury him, Mr. Watts, he was our gardener, he came over. He was exasperated because every time he would repair something, they were over tearing something else up. So he walked over to the children and he said, boys, have you ever thought about just asking the president to give this poor soldier a pardon? Tad, he got so excited about the possibility of that, he wasted no time to run up to the president's office and ask him for a pardon, which Mr. Lincoln granted. He wrote it all out. I, President Abraham Lincoln, do solemnly grant Jack the doll a pardon from his crimes. And he was thrilled. So this was one day we didn't have to unbury dear Jack. Now, during the war, Mr. Lincoln at the very beginning, had a visitor, his friend, Edward Baker. He was going to be fighting in one of the first battles, actually, of the war. And they sat under the tree in the White House lawn and talked and talked. And the next day, Mr. Edward Baker was killed. And our Willie was so shaken by that death because, you know, he knew Mr. Baker from Springfield and he had met him on many occasions, but he was so touched by this loss and what his father was feeling that he wrote a poem, he sent it to the newspaper, and they published it. We were so surprised. The newspaper sent his letter back to us so we would have it as a keepsake, but I can't find it, so I don't know where I've hidden it, but I do have his poem. And I would like to share that with you if I could, please. I will read it to you. It says, it's titled On the Death of Colonel Edward Baker. There was no patriot like Baker, so noble and so true. He fell as a soldier on the field, his face to the sky of blue. His voice is silent in the hall, which oft his presence graced. No more he'll hear the loud acclaim which rang from place to place. No squeamish notions filled his breast. The Union was his theme. No surrender and no compromise. His day thought and his night's dream. His country has her part to play towards those he has left behind. His widow and his children all, she must always keep in mind. It was such a lovely sentiment and so loved by Mr. Lincoln that his son took that time to do something for him for the heartbreak that he was experiencing from the loss of his dear friend, Edward Baker. Well, Mr. Lincoln, as I've said many times, he was one of the most kind, loving husband and father that a family could ever dream of. He is very indulgent with his children, I will admit. And he always says something to this effect. It is my pleasure that my children are free, happy, and restrained from parental tyranny. Love is the chain whereby to bind a child to his parents. And I think he's right. We do love our children. We love our children so very much. I don't know how we would get along if we lost any more. We've already lost our Eddie, and to lose another child would be heartbreaking, to say the least. Well, if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer any that you might have.
Yes, Mrs. Lincoln, thank you so much for sharing those stories. I really appreciate your perspective, sharing these stories. I think the Lincoln family, there's a lot that, my family or maybe other families watching out there, a lot to relate to. It's a family of joy and, happiness and laughter and pain and tragedy, much like all of us, feel in our everyday lives, the ups and the downs and, these great stories of raising kids in the White House, the pocket knife story and the burying of the soldier and the unburying, they're the Lincoln
what we do
family.
For our children.
Yeah, exactly. The Lincoln family is a family just like, your family, my family. So it's really great to hear those stories. So as Mrs. Lincoln mentioned, she'd love to answer some questions. We'll take a few questions here at the end of the program. So feel free to write those down in the comment section if you haven't done so already. Being that it is Abe Lincoln's 212th birthday, I was curious about this question as well too. Mrs. Lincoln, Linda is asking, Mary, how did you and the boys celebrate Mr. Lincoln's birthday? Are there any particular traditions or anything that you would do on his birthday?
Mr. Lincoln wasn't really one that wanted to celebrate his birthdays on many occasions just because he felt like it was a waste of time and energy. It's everybody has one type of mentality, and but I was always the birthday person. So I would always try to at least make him some of his favorite desserts or something that we would have after dinner, which, he was very fond of my white cake. But on his birthday, I would always add like strawberry preserves on top of it to give it a little bit more color and more flavor. But a birthday to him was just another day of the week.
Kimberly is asking, what did you like and dislike about living in the White House?
What did I like? Well, it wasn't exactly what I was expecting. First of all, the White House was in very much disrepair when we moved in. It was, the rugs were tattered and torn, the furniture they were so worn. In fact, I think some of the pieces were brought in by John Adams when he first moved into the White House, for heaven's sake. It was just, the wallpaper was stained and the curtains were torn and tattered. So I knew that there was some money allotted for repairing and redecorating the White House, which had not been used for the prior two presidents. So it was there and I took it. And I made the house beautiful again, new carpets, new drapes and things like that. But that's what I liked about it, was taking on a challenge to make this the family house of the president. It should be the finest house in the country. And it wasn't. It was in such bad repair. So I brought it back to life. In fact, we were told when we moved into the White House, we were going to be the last family. They were going to tear it down and build a new one because it was in such bad repair. But after I fixed it up, they decided, nope, they would go ahead and let it go on for a few more presidencies. And so, I was glad that I was able to do that. What I didn't like living in the White House, I spent a lot of time alone. I was so accustomed to it, though, from when Mr. Lincoln rode the circuit. But when I was in the White House, I was very alone. Even though we were in the same area, I saw very little of Mr. Lincoln. He was so busy. He's so busy trying to take care of this war, to keep a country moving forward. Just because you've got a war doesn't mean there's other things that you aren't having to take care of at the same time. So, but I just, that would be, for me, what I disliked was being so much alone. I would, have the children, but it wasn't like having companionship. Mr. Lincoln and I did spend many a late evening together. 10, 11 o'clock at night, we'd sit in the kitchen and Mr. Lincoln might have a little coffee and we would sit over the table and kind of talk, but it wasn't a lot of my day.
Mrs. Lincoln, Tina is watching on YouTube. She has a question. Do you know what year Mr. Lincoln started growing his beard? Or I've also heard there's a lovely story as to why he started growing his beard.
Yeah. A little girl had sent him a letter saying that, he'd be much more attractive because his face was so thin and, and tiny that, so drawn in that she thought if he filled it in, he'd be more attractive. But sadly, he had already started growing a little bit of a beard before he went to the White House. So it was already a little going, but it was sweet that somebody noticed that he needed something to make him look more, I don't want to say presidential, but maybe that was what he thought a president should have, more of a character to his face. He always felt like he was an ugly man. I always found him to be quite handsome, but he, the story when the man said, "You're two-faced," and he said, "Well, if I was two-faced, why would I wear this one?" Because he never thought his appearance was attractive. But I saw him as a very attractive man.
I noticed that in photos of Lincoln's time in Champaign County that we study at the Museum of the Grand Prairie, he doesn't have the beard. There's a photo taken of him at Samuel Altschuler's photography studio in downtown Urbana, not too far from our museum. The third ever photo taken of Abe Lincoln, and he has no beard.
When was that?
That was during his time riding the circuit.
Yeah, okay.
The exact year is escaping me right now, but
that's okay. No, I was trying to remember when I think I saw him actually not shave. That's one of those things you remember. Is like, when did he stop with his little straight razor shaving? It's like, I'm trying to remember. It's hard. I've slept since then.
Yeah, many times.
Yes.
Sarah has a question. Can you speak on the other women in Washington and their interactions with you?
Well, let's put it this way. Many of the women were Southern belles that would come into the White House, which is understandable because Washington City is a Southern site at that time. And but there were a few that I quite well did not get along with. I thought they were upstarts. And they didn't like me because I spoke my mind. And I spent a lot of time talking to men, which I found much more appealing than sitting there talking about some dress that we were getting made or a baby. I wanted to talk with the political side of the aisle. So I would ingratiate myself with the men because I was more interested in their conversations. And I think that was my side of that put them off about me, was the fact that I didn't spend much time with them, chit-chatting. And I don't like chit-chat. I want to get into the meat of a conversation. That's why I held so many coteries in my house when would be women in Springfield that were also interested in the political field, but we weren't allowed to express that openly as women because, we don't have an opinion that matters to anybody because we can't vote. We don't, there's just a lot of things that curtails us from even expressing. Why would you even believe that? Who cares?
Mrs. Lincoln, thank you. If you wouldn't mind, I'd love to speak to a friend of yours, Pam Brown, with a few questions, if that would be okay.
Okay.
Pam, thank you so much for doing this, portraying Mrs. Lincoln. I had a question, if you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience. How'd you get started in portraying Mrs. Lincoln? And, why do you continue to do it? Why do you see it as an important thing to do for you?
All right. Yes, I am Pam Brown, and I don't have a Southern accent. But I'm a trained actor. I went to college at the University of Oklahoma, Boomer Sooner, and I have a degree in acting and directing and a master's in directing because in Oklahoma you got paid if you were a director. So I thought, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to direct. But long story short, the museum, the American Presidential Museum here in Springfield, decided to do a play called The Last of Mrs. Lincoln at the museum. It was just shortly after they had opened, and it was in 2006 when they had the auditions. And I thought, wouldn't that be nice to play, a woman with such, dominance in the historical world? So I went to these auditions, and I was very familiar with the director's way of doing auditions. He likes them in a semicircle, and you just kind of take turns going down the semicircle. But there was one scene in the play, because I had already read the play, that I really, really, really wanted to read, which was, I always labeled it the letter. And it's a letter Mary's writing to Louis Baker, which was her nephew. So I sat about 2/3 of the way around on the semicircle, and we read, got to the letter, and it fell right in my lap, literally in my lap. Well, I did the one thing we were always taught in school to never do, which was use an accent. But I'm going, you can't do Mary Lincoln and not have a little bit of a Southern drawl, because she was Kentucky and it's very throaty. So it's very different than just doing a Gentile. No, Mary would have been a little bit more throaty. So I thought, I'm pulling out all the stops, and if it kills me, then that's the way it goes. So I started reading very slowly with my Southern dialect, and I was watching Phil, who was writing, and then he looked up, and he put his pencil down, he leaned back in his chair, and he folded his arms, and I read that entire 7-minute monologue. So it was kind of neat. And when I finished that night, I just sat, I said, "You've got this." There was no doubt in my mind, even though there was two other women that were also being called back for the role of Mary. We were going through all this one scene, which we called the crazy scene, when she's losing touch with reality between her and Robert. It's a very volatile scene. And but after about 3 weeks of reading that, then I get a little email saying I have found my Mary, and that's history. And right after I finished the play, there's always a letdown after you finish a play, because you've spent all this time with all these people, and suddenly, you got all this free time. But 2 weeks after that, I got an email from Beardstown Historical Society, and they wanted me to come and talk about Mary. And I'm thinking, I don't know anything about Mary. I know enough to get me through a play. I thought, but they offered me money to come and talk. And I thought, this could be fun, because I loved her. I was so emotionally wrapped up in her because of the things that I had to experience, her mental breakdown after losing Tad. Tad was the hardest, was when she loses Tad, because that was her go-to kid. I always feel the sorriest for Tad, because he dealt with her manic moments like a champion, but he was the one that was able to bring her back down when she was manicking, either sad or angry or whatever the case may be. So I was missing her, and I had invested so much in her, who she was emotionally, that it was a delight. So I went to Beardstown. I read a biography. I took notes that I thought, and all this. But as I'm taking notes, I'm reading, how private she was. She was very private. She would not have just stood here and told stories, So I have to put her in a time and place. That's why you have a set behind you. It's your set for your play. So if you make it into a one act, you can break that fourth wall, and I'm still doing her justice, because Mary would never just stand up at a podium and tell you her life story, because she would say it's none of your business. But it is your business as a historian, as people who want to know more about the family. So you have to find a way. So that's when I contacted a friend, Kim Bradbury. He's a local playwright who just passed away in 2018. He was a big part of my life. I cry whenever I think about him, because if he had not written my first one act for me, I never would have found Mary's voice for me, my voice, the one that I want to share. Mary's sense of humor, Mary's her love, because all people talked about in Springfield when I first moved here was how snotty she was, and how she was mean to Mr. Lincoln. And it's like, was she really that awful? That's all I could think. But so as I read, it's like, this woman had such a huge heart, and it gets missed. So a lot of us that do presentations as Mary Lincoln, we try so hard to show her as a three-dimensional person, not just a one-dimensional person, because a lot of people read the Herndon book, which really does not paint her in a very nice light. And I think because of that book, she's gotten a bad rap. So it's been our for the past, I'd say 20 years, is these people, me and many other of my friends that are also Mary Lincoln presenters. That's what we want to do, is make her happy. And that's how I got started. And I love it. There's nothing more than when I do my one acts. I would love one time to do one of my one acts for you, which is actually time and place. And there's a lot more emotion, because it's crying and it's laughing and it's just everything. And that to me really shows who Mary is, when I get to break that fourth wall and suck you into her box of memories.
I would be very interested in that. So we'll have to maybe chat a little bit farther down the line and see if we can bring you back.
I also have a presentation where Mary's in New York getting ready to leave for France after her institutionalization. And so it's about her institutionalization, and she's being interviewed by a reporter, which you don't see, but I'm answering his questions about, what was the building like? What was, so it's kind of an interaction with nobody, but, I repeat his questions so you know what they just asked me. But it's an interesting one. It was the hardest for me to write, just because it was such a part of her life that she would just have soon done without, And then there's a lot of conversation, should she have been institutionalized? Should she not? If anybody's interested, if you go out and look up the insanity retrial of Mary Todd Lincoln, that's me. And we did a retrial of her with the Supreme Court. It was put on by the ladies of the Supreme Court here in Illinois. And it was an interesting project, because the one in Chicago that we did was not scripted. So it went on for almost 4 hours. It was only supposed to be an hour and a half long, but my defense attorneys were so determined I was going to win. they would not stop. They just kept going. It's like, oh my God. So, but it has been trimmed down to an hour and a half.
That's great. That's great, Pam.
So,
I know you got places to be. Maybe time for
yeah,
one more question. So you talked about, you read biographies, and you mentioned that a lot of people learned about Mary from the Herndon book, and that painted her in a bad light. Erin has a question. She's watching from Parkville, Missouri, and she's asking what books about yourself, about Mrs. Lincoln, do you recommend to learn more about her life?
Okay. I like the Clinton book. I think it's just Mary Lincoln. It's a brown cover. It's a decent book. But my go-to these days has been by Stacy Pratt McDermott. She used to work for the Lincoln Papers, but for her PhD, she wrote a biography of Mary Lincoln, and I like it because it's just the facts. It's called Southern Girl, Northern Woman. The story of Mary Lincoln or something like that. But it's Southern Girl, Northern Woman, and it's by Stacy Pratt McDermott. And it's just the facts. She leaves the innuendo up to you, how you think everything mashes together. This is going on in her life, this is going on in her life, and this happens. Did anyone, it's just a nice overview. I would say warn the print is small because basically they took her PhD thesis and turned it into a book. So the print is small. so if you can get it on on a book, where you can blow up the print, I would suggest doing that. I don't know if it's accessible on a like Kindle or something like that, where you can bring up the print, but it's a great book.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Mrs. Lincoln. Thank you, Pam, so much.
Yes.
There's a lot of love from folks watching out there. I figured I'd share that with you here at the end. David says, lovely stories. Had never heard these before.
Good.
Judith, great storyteller. Mike Warden, Pam Brown is wonderful as Mary. This is the 7th time that I've seen her portray her.
Mike Warden, he's a fan.
Judith, very well done. I really enjoyed this. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, this is so nice. Thank you for sharing these.
Sure. Jan, agreed. I've seen and heard Pam Brown as Mary Lincoln, and she is phenomenal. Great presentation. Loved it from Christine. Lauren, what a wonderful program. Thank you.
Hi, Lauren.
So many kind words from everybody watching out there. Phil, this is such a great program. Thank you so much. And Ginny, last one here that I'll share, enjoyed it very much. But there's more than those that I just showed Pam and Mrs. Lincoln.
Oh, print them off and send them to me. I like adulation.
Sure, yeah.
Who doesn't like to hear good things about yourself when you
exactly, yeah, especially with such a good job that you do.
Well, thank you.
I really appreciate it. And Don just asked this question: is the broadcast available to watch later? This broadcast will be. This recording will be on our Facebook and YouTube pages to watch. So watch it after if you'd like to rewatch it. Pam, thank you so much for joining us and doing this program today. Really appreciate it. I know you got places to be, people to see, so I won't keep you any longer.
With Mr. Lincoln, we're going to have an afternoon together, finally.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for watching. Mrs. Lincoln, I'll let you get back to your husband, spend some time together, and go out, everybody, and do your best to celebrate Abe Lincoln's birthday as best as you can, as safely as you can on his 212th birthday. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.